I say the word pirate, you've probably got a few images that are springing into your mind. One is probably someone with a big beard, a bigger hat, a parrot and a peg leg, whilst the other might be Johnny Depp with some heavy eyeliner on. And whilst both of these images have some merit to them, they leave out a lot of what pirate society was really like. And you may think of it as barbaric and violent, and aspects of it definitely were, and that's something that's important to remember. But there were also aspects that were remarkably egalitarian and progressive. And it's these aspects that our society should be aspiring to today. And in fact, I think we already are aspiring to those aspects. We just don't realize that pirates had already done it about 300 years ago. But what is it that we're actually aspiring to in our utopian society? Well, firstly, democracy. I think most of us would agree we like democracy. We like the idea that our opinion matters, that our views are heard, that we get a say in how we're being governed. And again, pirates had this. Next, we have equality. Clearly, there are many different strands of this, but in this talk, I will just be briefly touching on racial and gender equality. And again, this is something that we see in every utopian society that we envision. It's something that we want. We want people to be treated in the same way, regardless of who they are. And again, this is something that pirates already had. But what's the evidence for this? How did they actually show it? Well, firstly, democracy. Now, when you think of a pirate captain, you probably think of someone quite tyrannical. But funnily enough, a crew didn't really want that. So they put in ways to make sure that it didn't happen. The first of these was that the captain was elected to their post, and they could also be unelected from it. Now, this was a vote in the crew, and everybody had the same vote, and it needed a majority to get passed. This meant that the captain couldn't just do whatever they wanted. They had to keep the crew fairly happy, otherwise they would just get voted out of their position. Captain Charles Johnson summarised this in his book, A General History of Pirates. He said that the crew allowed him to be captain over them on the condition that they could be captain over him. I think that summarises it very nicely. It was a radical democracy that really was a power to the people. So that was one way. The second is that the captain was not the only position of authority aboard a ship. You also had the quartermaster. Again, this position was elected and could be unelected by the crew. Their job was really to keep the captain in check, make sure the power wasn't really going to their heads. So you had the quartermaster keeping the captain in check, and the crew keeping them both in check. Again, a way that we can see when pirates got to decide who was governing them. Lastly, we have the fact that pirate captains only ever had supreme authority if there was a chase or a fight. And this was more for practical reasons rather than anything else. If you imagine that you're aboard a pirate ship and there's another ship coming towards you, you're preparing to board, you're psyching yourself up for the fight. You've got somebody on your left shouting at you to do one thing, somebody on your right shouting at you to do an entirely different thing. The poor person in the middle is going to have no idea what they're supposed to be doing. You'll probably end up doing something completely different to the person standing beside you. Chaos will ensue. The fight probably won't go very well. It's not going to end well for you, I'm afraid. But this is when you need that one individual to stand up and make the decisions. And that person, quite naturally, is the captain. But in every other situation, every other decision that was made, it went to a vote. Again, the crew got to decide how they lived and how they were governed. So this is how a radical democracy started aboard a pirate ship and avoided the tyranny that we commonly think of. But, of course, to every rule, there is an exception. And in this case, it is that of Edward Teach, or more famously known as Blackbeard. He, of course, was a pirate captain, and there is an example where he was playing cards with a crew member, Israel Hands, and seemingly unprovoked, just stood up, shot him through the kneecap, so that he could never walk properly again. The violence in itself is bad enough, but what is even worse is the fact that there was no accountability for this. This was a moment where the crew should have stood up, realised that they didn't want to be shot through the leg, and unelected Blackbeard from the captaincy. But this didn't happen. Blackbeard remained the captain. So the democracy, it didn't really work. Maybe the crew was too afraid of Blackbeard to try and question him. Or maybe they respected him as a captain in general and didn't want to lose that. But either way, you still had a pretty tyrannical captain. And that, it got rid of the democracy aboard the ship. But I still think that in general, there was a radical democracy aboard pirate ships, where you really could get your opinion heard and really did get a say in how you'd be able to live your life. And that is something we would all love to have. Next, we have racial equality. Now, the early 1700s were a time when the slave trade was booming. You had big empires like the Spanish and the British making a lot of money off of the exploitation of people. But it may surprise you to hear that pirates didn't really join in on this. Despite being all in it for the profit, they didn't get that profit by exploiting slaves. Instead, when they came across a slave vessel, they would generally release the slaves. But don't get me wrong, this wasn't a moral mission. They didn't go out intending to release slaves. Probably they went out intending to get a bigger and better boat. And if there were slaves aboard it, they would more often than not release them. And then they would offer them a choice. Either they could continue to land, or alternatively, they could join the crew. Unsurprisingly, most people chose the latter. They had nothing waiting for them on land, and they couldn't really go home. So becoming a pirate seemed like a pretty good lifestyle. And in this way, many people found a form of brotherhood aboard a pirate ship, and they were easily and happily accepted into the ranks. So much so that in 1717, Blackbeard's own crew was made up of 60% of people who had African heritage. Clearly, pirates were happy to accept you into the ranks, regardless of what your skin colour was. You were treated the same when you were aboard the ship, and there are examples of black captains being ruling over a crew of a majority white people. Again, this is something that we aspire to. It's something that we're trying to do and that we're progressing towards. Next, we have gender equality. Now, this is harder to see in pirate society, mostly because there just weren't that many women there. Now, you could say that this was because of old maritime superstitions, that pirates believed it was bad luck to have a woman on board, and so actively tried to exclude them from piracy. Or you could take a slightly more practical route and say that many women just didn't want to be pirates. They didn't want to spend weeks and weeks on a ship surrounded by mostly drunken men. Perhaps they would have found the physical labour too demanding. And that wouldn't be surprising. If any of you have ever been sailing, you'll know how physically demanding it is. And if you had to do that for weeks on end, it would be even more so. So tough that many men would not have been up to it. And women, being on average just biologically less strong than men, would have found that even more difficult. But despite this, there were still women in piracy. And two of those women who became very famous are Anne Bonny and Mary Read. Now, they were both on the same ship, the ship that was captained by Jack Rackham, the man who created the famous Jolly Roger flag. Now, Rackham knew that they were women, but he chose not to tell the crew. Perhaps that points towards the fact that maybe an acceptance of gender wasn't across all of pirate society. Maybe it was just a few especially egalitarian individuals who were trying to promote it. But later on in their career as pirates, Mary and Anne were known to be women aboard the ship. The crew seemed to accept this. In fact, there are eyewitness testimonies that describe them as the most courageous of all the crew members, that they were the first aboard the deck and the last down in a fight. and they were accepted and respected for this. To a pirate, it didn't matter what gender you were, it didn't matter what race you were or where you came from. What mattered was if you could do the job. If you were courageous and you had the qualities that they respected, then you would be accepted onto a pirate crew. This is a kind of meritocracy that would be amazing if we could see in our societies, where regardless of your background, of your race or your gender, it didn't matter. What mattered was how good you were at what you were doing. And if you could do the job, and you could do the job well, then you would be rewarded for it. This is something that we want to see. So, we have seen that pirate society had aspects that were egalitarian, and that we should be aspiring towards it. But can we actually make it a reality? Well, the Pirate Golden Age, it didn't last very long. It was only about 30 years. So perhaps something this radical and this progressive was just too unstable to last. Perhaps it only lasted for as long as it did because of the small size of the societies. Really, each pirate vessel was its own society. So a maximum, you would have a few hundred people, and the smallest would probably be about 20. Clearly, it is a lot easier to get your opinion heard when there's only a few hundred, compared to our countries where we have tens of thousands at the least. It's very different actually saying your piece, rather than just ticking a box on a ballot card. But most importantly, I think, is the fact that pirates had a kind of shared background. They had all suffered in some way from the life that they were trying to escape, whether it be from colonialism or sexism or capitalism. They had all suffered, and they had all got a vision for a better world in their minds. And they wanted and needed it so much that they went and they made it happen. I'm not sure if we have that kind of shared vision, or if we would be able to just go off and make it a reality. So, while we should, and we are, aspiring to these aspects of egalitarianism within pirate society, I fear that they may have to remain mere aspirations rather than a reality. Thank you.